Hashem. Today's daf yomi is Avodah Zarah daf Nun Hey Avodah Zarah 55, and we are going to start on 55a, 6 lines from the top. Today's daf is dedicated for a shmir for the Chayalim, that's all for the Shvuyim and Yeshua for Am Yisrael. Gemara tells us that Shoah Agrippus Sar Tzava, that's Rabbi Gamliel, that Agrippus, who was, Rashi says, an idolater, he was in charge of the army, and it was in the days of King Agrippus. It was not the same. He wasn't the king, but he was the general. So Agrippus, the general, for King Agrippus, asked Rabbi Gamliel, "Ksiv Torah, it says in your Torah, that Hashem, your God, is a fiery, consuming God, an all-consuming, fiery God. Kel Kanai is a zealous God. So why is he jealous? Wise person is only jealous of another wise person. He's not jealous of somebody who's stupid. And a gibor is only jealous of another mighty person. And Asher on a wealthy man on a wealthy man. So why is he jealous of the idolaters? There must be something to these idols. So Amar Lo, Rabbi Gamliel says, I'll give you a parable. What's the matter like? Adam shenasa isha al ishto chashuva. A man marries a woman. In addition to his first wife, he marries a second wife, and she's more distinguished than the first wife. So a miskanaba. So then the first wife is not going to be jealous of the second wife. She's not going to be upset about it to hate her husband, because she's saying, okay, I understand why he took this better wife. She's better than me. She's got better milos than me. So therefore, I understand why he went after and took a second wife. But if she is, see, even though it says ba, it really should be bo based on Rashi, because if she's less distinguished than him, then less distinguished than the first wife, then she's going to be upset at the husband. Why are you taking a wife that's not as distinguished as me? And that's how Rashi understands it. Okay, so continuing in the Gemara, Amro is Zunin, and Rashi says that Zunin was the Yisrael, that Zunin was a Jew. Yisrael, and he said to Rabbi Akiva, Libi v'libcha yodea da'avodas kochavim leis b'mashash. He says, we both know that the idolatry is obviously nothing. But yet we see the Gavri, the Azli ki mispari, that there are people are go when then they've got their broken limbs, and they go to the idolaters to heal their limbs, and then when they come back, they're all healed. So also kimitzamdi, my time. What's the reason? It looks like the idolatry works. So Rabbi Akiva says, I'll give you a parable. What's it like? Adam neman shaya b'ir, a person who's trustworthy in the city. Everybody in the city deposits, gives them their deposits. Shelo be'edim, they don't even require witnesses. And then there's another person who comes, and he only deposits with witnesses. One time this guy goes and he leaves without the witnesses. So Amaro Ishto, so the trustworthy man's wife says, Bovinech Parno, we'll go and we'll be kofar, we'll deny it, and we'll say that you didn't give it to us. Amarwa v'chi mipnei she shota zeh asa shlokog. And he said, because this idiot acted improperly, anu navod esumanasenu, we're going to lose our whole business. Our whole business is based upon trust. So we're going to lose our whole business because this guy's being a jerk to us? No. We're going to continue to do what we do. Afkach yisurin, also affliction. When they're sent upon a person, mashpinosan shalotelchu el biomponi, votetu el biomponi. The Hashem makes the afflictions take an oath that they are only going to come on this day and they're going to depart on this day. B'shah ponis, and on this time, they poni, and through this person, they samponi, and this doctor and this medicine will cause them to depart. Kiva shengias manalot says, once the time comes to leave, All that will base of Otis Kochavim. It just so happens to be, as a coincidence, this guy went to the idolatry. So Amru Yisurin Denu Shalo Neitze. So therefore, the Yisurin say Dinu Shalo Neitze. They say maybe we shouldn't leave. So the Yisurin say, well, maybe we shouldn't leave because he went to the idolatry. We don't want him to think that the idolatry is correct. But then the afflictions come back and say, because this guy acted improperly, are we going to also act improperly? So we're not going to basically act improperly just because of this fool. So, and that's what Rabbi Yochanan says. Why does it say the afflictions are bad and trusted? They're bad in their mission because they hurt the body. But they're trusted by their oath, meaning they keep their promise to God. Rava bar Yitzchak or Rabbi Yehuda. But there are some idolaters, there are some idol places of idolatry in our place. When the people require rain, they have a vision. A man comes to them in the vision. When he says to them, kill this man, and I'll bring the rain. And in fact, that's what happened. They slaughtered the man, and the rain came on their way. So Rabbi Yehuda says to Rabbi Bar Yitzchak, if I had died, I would never have been able to teach you this. Good thing I'm not dead. What do we do with the fact that the pasuk says that it says Asher don't follow after these idols which God split up amongst all the nations of the world. That God gives them words, He gives them space to make a mistake, in order to eventually punish them from this world. This is what Reish Lakish says. For the mockers, God will cause mockery, and for the poor people, He will give grace or compassion. And if somebody wants to come and be tamei, God opens the door and allows them to become tamei. But if somebody wants to become purified, so God helps them. Meaning to say, whatever you want to do, you're going to be able to do. God is going to be more of a help to you if you want to do the right thing. But even if you want to do the wrong thing, God is going to open the door and allow you to do it. So God is not going to destroy the idolatry just because there are some people in the world who worship idolatry. Hashem is going to allow us to do whatever we want. So now we come up to the next Mishnah. It says the Mishnah, Lokhan gat beuta min ovik chavim afal pi she'unota biyado v'nosan l'tafuach. So a person is allowed to purchase a gat beuta. So this is a press where the idolaters stepped on the grapes and pressed the grapes. You had to purchase that from the idols, the idolaters, even though he picked it up in his hand and stuck it into a pile. Look at Rashi. He took the grapes from the wine. Mish, or is a mixture. He took this mixture, or what is it called? I think is an English word. I forget it begins with an M. This mixture of the grape and the wines, when it's first coming to be together, mead or something like that. I don't know exactly the word, but Rashi says in the Old French it's called the mish, this mixture. So basically, that the idolaters step on the grapes, and then he picks up the grapes from the wine, from the not from the dregs, from the skins or from the crushed grapes, and he puts it in a pile. and Rashi says this is the gathering, asifas gawan of him. This is the gathering of a mound of grapes. Shatachas hakora, underneath a beam. It's called a tapuach or belaz, and in French it's called the shtak. Because savar tana didon will have a yayin nesach because he says it's not going to be considered the yayin nesach, the prohibited wine, until it goes down into the pit. So you're allowed to purchase this press grapes from the idolater, even though he had picked them up and put them into the pile. But it's a yayin nesach, and it's not going to be considered this yayin nesach, this prohibited wine, ad sheyered lebor, until it goes down into a cistern. Ma'asher bebor asar v'ashar muter, and then we say that which is in the cistern or the vat is going to be prohibited, but the rest is going to be permitted. Let's look at Rashi here. Let's say the idolater touched it after it's in the cistern. Then everything after that is prohibited. Bor Rashi says, "How you osin with neagat, va'quina soon sham yayin." They would make a cistern in front of the press, and there would be a utensil there to receive the wine. V'yesh shetachan abor besid, and there are some who line this cistern with plaster. Vayayim mishtamer besocho, when the wine is washed in it, beino ma'abe tipa, and doesn't lose a drop, and that's called a bor sit. Dorchen ma'ove kochavim begat, and your Jew is allowed to press the grapes with the idolater in the press. Rashi says, "V'lo amrinan," we're not going to say mistaker b'suriyanahu. We're not going to say the Jew is getting benefit, making money from something that's prohibited to have benefit. Yayin nesach is prohibited, but this is not part of that. Because according to this Tana, even to drink this wine at this point while it's in the press, Tana the Shari calls matchal here, but labor, as long as the juice has not flowed into the cistern, it's permitted. When we show gorem tuma, and we're also not going to be concerned that he's causing tuma to the grapes in the liquid. Because the moment the idolater touched them, pressed them a little bit, they became tamei. And he's not helping him commit a sin. The idolater is not commanded not to make them tamei, so you're not helping him in any way. So therefore, that's why Rashi says there's no problem to press it with the idolater in the press on the top of 55b. But you're not allowed to harvest the grapes. Counterintuitively, you can't press it with him because you're allowed to press it with him in the vat because it's already become tamei, but you can't harvest it with the idolater. Rashi explains, if Fisha knows them begat tameya v'gorim tumahu, because they're going to put these grapes they're harvesting into a press that's tamei, and they're going to cause the grapes to become tamei. Because you're putting them in the press in order to press them, and that will be what makes them tamei. But kodem dricha, and before the pressing, vaday will makabel tuma, they won't be able to contract tuma, distama lo hochshru, because we assume that there was no liquid that touched the grapes would have made them capable of becoming tamei. And that which we are going to say, habotzer legat hochshur, that if it, Rashi is raising a question, which we'll deal with, that about a later statement that says if you harvest it into the press, it automatically becomes capable of becoming tamei. That is where it was already had liquid on it. Because Sovereign Rashi says the author of this Tana is at the position also that there's a prohibition of taking something which is not tamei, chulin, and not sacred, and causing it to become tamei in the land of Israel. So therefore, you know how to harvest with him. So then the Mishnah says, Yisrael shu osa betuma. Let's say there's a Jew who's pressing these grapes in a state of ritual impurity. Look at Rashi. Yisrael osa peirosa betuma. The Jew who's making these fruits in a state of ritual impurity. Over Avero, he's violating a sin. Sharin it's tavalkach, because he's commanded not to make these the food tamei. Hilkachafilu dorchen nami aser. So even to press with him is prohibited. Shedrichasan ba'avera begat tameya, because you're pressing them in a sin in a tamei vat. Udrichasan hu ikar tuman son. Kshnas and mashken and tamein ayidegat. And pressing them is the main concept of making them tamei. When the liquid comes, they're tamei from the gat. But also a sayideo over there. You know how to help somebody commit a sin. Now a partial man, you have to separate from these Jews, kadeshal yarga, so he doesn't get used to it. But the idolater is not commanded against it, so you can help the idolater, but not the Jew. You know how to press with him or harvest with him. But you're allowed to bring with him a barrel of gat to the press, and bring it for him from the press. Rashi says you can bring the empty barrels of the gat to the press, and you're allowed to bring from him the barrels that are full from the gat, because there's no sin. Because since they already became tamei, you're allowed to put the wine in these tamei barrels. And then the Gemara concludes with the halacha of a baker. If there's a baker who is making the bread in a state of ritual impurity, you're now to knead it and arrange the dough with him. Altar, tas, but you're allowed to bring it to the communal oven. So you're now allowed to knead and dough because you're making it tamei, and that's going to be a problem. Amar Rav Huna yayin kiven shehitchil imashech ose yayin nesach. So Rav Huna says that once the wine begins to fall down into the cistern, that's when it's called wine and can become yayin nesach. Rashi explains that the press was made on a slant, and so therefore, from the time it begins to flow from the upper part to the lower part, and they had like some sort of filter in between, but for the time it begins to flow, then it's called the yayin, flow downward. So Gemara says, Tanan, but how could this be? We say specifically that you're allowed to put in your hands, take the wine from the lochem gat. You're allowed to take the pressed grapes you're allowed to purchase it from the idolater. And even though he put it in his hand and put it into the tapuach, and there we assume from the press it had already began to flow, so it's yayin nesach. So the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Huna, that Rav Huna answers, how would he answer this problem? He says, begat bekukom leah. No, we're talking about a press that's stuffed up and it's full. And so therefore, there's no flowing downwards until you remove the cork, and then the wine will flow down. So we're talking about a case where it didn't start to flow down yet. Tashma, yarad labor. It says in the Mishnah, whatever went down into the cistern, masha bebor asar vashar mutter. Whatever's in the cistern is prohibited, and the rest is permitted. So we see from here that even once it started to flow, it's not yet prohibited. Amar Rav Huna kasha. So Rav Huna has to say, well, we have two teachings here. Kama Mishnah Rishona, Kama Mishnah Achrona. There's an initial teaching and a later teaching. And Rav Huna, who says that Rav Huna follows the later teaching, which says it's tamei once it starts to flow downward, even though it's not there. Whereas our Mishnah is following the initial teaching that says it's only tamei once it's in the cistern. And how do we know this? The time we went to the Brayso of Rishona, how you omrim, badad. At first they used to say, but at first they used to say, Berishona ayu omrim, badad, which is a simon. Ain botrin ovikchav. You're not allowed to harvest with the idolater. Begat you're not, and begat also grum tumulchul and shabarit Yisrael. You're not allowed to harvest with the idolater in the press, or meaning you're not allowed to press with the idolater, because you're not allowed to cause tumah for chulin in the land of Israel. What's the reason? Because the Prushim in the land of Israel, Rashi says, used to eat chulin in a state of tahara. So therefore they made a prohibition on all the chulin, not allowed to make the chulin of Eretz Yisrael tamei. So So you're not allowed to harvest the grapes with the idolater in the press because you're not allowed to cause tumah for chul and eretz Yisrael. Ein dorchem in Yisrael she'osa perosa v'tumah. And you're not allowed to press with a Jew who makes his fruit in a state of tumah. And she'also sayidei over. You're not allowed to help him. You're not allowed to help him do a sin, and according to him in Eretz Yisrael, it's a sin. But you want to press with the idolater in the press, because because we're not concerned that it's going to be yain nesach, like Rav Huna says, until it actually came down into the cistern. The chazru omar, and then they changed their mind and they said debab. So first they had said badad, which stood for bochim, dorchem, and dorchem, and now they say debab, which stands for dorchem, bochim, bochim. Ain't dorchem over chum bagat. It says you're not allowed to press with the idolater in the gat. And the reason is because it's already starting to go down and it turns into wine, the yain nesach. And so therefore you're not allowed to press with him in the press. Mishum Rav Huna, exactly the concern of Rav Huna. Main bochim in Yisrael she'osei peiros betuma. You're also not allowed to harvest it with a Jew who does his peiros in a state of tumah. The kol shekain shein dorchem, and for sure you're not allowed to press with him because it's for sure tamei there, and you're being misayeh to Eretz Yisrael. Misayeh lidei tumah. Avabotzrim im ovikol begat shemutar will grow tumah l'chol and sheberetz Yisrael. But you're allowed to press with, you're allowed to harvest with the idolater in the press, shemutar because you're allowed to cause tumah in the land of Israel if it's a nachri's food, which is not going to cause tamei. Let's just read the Rashi on these 2 points. Ain't botzrin in Israel. You're not allowed to harvest with a Jew who's making his fruit in a state of tumah. Mishum degorim tumahu, because you're causing it to become tamei. Even though here we're going to say you're allowed to cause tumah for chulin, like we said at the end of this, the end of this brisa. That's only in the case of idolatry. That's only in the case of an idolater. Avodah Yisrael tevulah with truma, but the Jew's food is tevel and it can become truma. But also tumah with truma, since it's potentially truma, you can't cause tumah. And so therefore, you're not allowed to cause tumah. And for sure, you're not allowed to press it. Because by pressing it, you're causing the liquid to come out, to become tamei. You're causing it to become tamei. So I'm just going to go on a little bit now because Baruch Hashem, tonight and tomorrow morning, I'm not going to be able to do it at the same time. So we learned in the Mishnah with respect to the wine of the press of the nachri. It doesn't become yain nesach until it actually goes into the cistern. So from the time it goes into the pit, it's called wine with respect to yain nesach. So the Gemara is going to challenge it from a Mishnah in Maasros, but then we learn in the Mishnah in Maasros with respect to. Then we learn with respect to Maasros, with respect to the actual shear. At what point is it required to take Maaser? Yayin mishe yikape. The wine, it's the moment when you're chayv Maaser is when the wine is beginning to basically float over the dregs of the grapes. And so it's not when it goes down into the pit, it's only when it's floating above the skin, which is later. So Amarav Kasha, Ha, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbanan. There's 2 opinions here. So the position of our Mishnah is going to be the Rabbanan. The Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Mishiyer Labor, when's it called yain nesach? When it goes out into the pit. Rabbi Akiva Omer Mishe Yikaf. And no, when the wine is basically much greater than the skins and it's floating over the skin. Meaning when the skins begin to float, the skins of the grapes. Ibailu, so the Gemara, you know what, we'll stop here. We'll stop here. Baruch Hashem, and God willing, we'll record the Daf Yomi or Nun Vav either tonight or tomorrow. Yeshikoch to everybody.
Thank you. Safe